Excellencies, distinguished moderator, speakers and guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of the Executive Director of the ASEAN Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome you all to another cycle of the ASEAN Institute for Peace and Reconciliation discussion series. This year's discussion series are in conjunction with the May I repeat again? This year's discussion series are in conjunction with the ASEAN-IPR's 10th anniversary commemorative activities. On 18 November 2012, the ASEAN leaders launched the ASEAN-IPR at the 21st ASEAN Summit, following the adoption of the Institute's terms of reference in July of that same year. 10 years hence, the ASEAN-IPR has carried out over 40 activities, including research, trainings, symposia, workshops, webinars, university tour, focus group discussions, as well as outreach activities to engage all layers of stakeholders. The discussion series has become one of the ASEAN-IPR's flagship programs. Through these sessions, the Institute could disseminate information, network with like-minded organizations, continue discourses, and share best practices regarding peace, conflict resolution, and reconciliation. I would like to take this chance to convey our gratitude and appreciation to the Embassy of Ireland and the Embassy of Finland in Jakarta for their generous support for this year's discussion series. This will be the second year that we are beneficiaries of their generosity and strong support in maintaining open, democratic, and frank discussions on peace, conflict resolution, and reconciliation in the region. The 2022 discussion series cycle will explore several topics not yet covered in the past 11 sessions that we have organized since 2020. And this afternoon, we will start the first theme or the first session of this year, discussing about early warning capabilities, effective conflict prevention. As per ASEAN practice, I would like to request for a group photo involving the moderator and all the speakers. So if I may request now, all distinguished panelists to activate their camera, and the ASEAN-IPR Secretariat will assist in taking a screenshot of the screen. Thank you. Okay, I will count down. 3, 2, 1. And once more. 3, 2, 1. And just one more time for luck. 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin today's discussion, please allow me to brief you on some housekeeping rules to ensure everybody's comfort in following the discussion. The discussion is about 2.5 hours long. This event is simultaneously live streamed on the ASEAN-IPR YouTube channel. Please ensure that you have a steady internet connection and an updated version of the Zoom software. During the presentation of the speakers, attendees in Zoom who wish to pose a question to the speakers, please do so in the Q&A box. And viewers on YouTube, you may use the chat box on your screen. Please follow the format, the question format on the chat box as informed by the organizers. We request that you refrain from using the chat or message box as personal platforms of extensive discussion. And please be considerate and polite in your messages. Thank you for respecting the house rules. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to introduce our moderator, His Excellency Mr. Lawrence Anderson, the representative of Singapore to the Advisory Board of the ASEAN-IPR. Mr. Lawrence Anderson is currently a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Mr. Anderson was the former ambassador of Singapore to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the non-resident ambassador to the Kingdom of Bahrain from March 2013 to September 2019. Prior to joining RSIS, Mr. Anderson was the director of the Asia-Europe Foundation, where he oversaw ASEF's work in acting as a civil society outreach for the Asia-Europe meeting and to promote people-to-people exchange between Asia and Europe. Mr. Anderson joined the Singapore Foreign Service in 1984. His overseas postings include the Singapore Permanent Mission to the United Nations in New York, the Singapore Embassy in Washington, and the Singapore Embassy in Bangkok. He was also Singapore Ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia from 2004 to 2007. And Mr. Anderson also served concurrently as Director of Special Duties in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Diplomat in Residence at the Civil Service College from 2011 to 2013. Without further ado, Mr. Anderson, I now hand over the screen and the discussion to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Katika. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to welcome you to the first session of the ASEAN-IPR Discussion Series 2022. The topic is early warning capabilities, effective conflict prevention, and it is timely. It is something we should all be concerned with. ASEAN has enjoyed relative peace and stability over most of the past years, and this has been in no small part due to the efforts of its member states and related forums, as well as the values that we uphold as a community. However, recent global developments have called into question how long we in ASEAN will continue to enjoy this relatively peaceful situation. Hence, the relevance of today's topic to explore the capabilities of effective conflict prevention through the setting up of early warning mechanisms or indicators. We are fortunate to have 4 expert speakers to share their thoughts and suggestions. Our first speaker, Dr. Rudi Sukandar, is an Associate Fellow at the Habibie Center in Jakarta and Director for Research, Publications and Community Service at the LSPR Communications and Business Institute, also in Jakarta. Dr. Sukandar obtained his doctoral degree from the School of Communication Studies, Ohio University, USA, specializing in relating and organizing intercultural communication and conflict. His research focuses on communal and international conflict, interpersonal communication, pop culture, and media studies. Recently, he has been involved in community empowerment in raising inclusivity and trust through technology applications or Cerita program to train Indonesian youth on storytelling to strengthen trust, tolerance, and inclusivity. Dr. Sukandar will be speaking to us on the National Violence Monitoring System, which was implemented by the Habibie Center. So, Pak Sukandar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pak Lawrence, for the kind introduction, the moderator of our discussion forum today. Excellencies, fellow speakers, ladies and gentlemen, there are 6 questions posed to me by the moderators, and I would like to answer them. Mostly about lesson learned from Indonesian experience, and then I'd like to answer the questions based on the points that I would like to share with you. Let me just share the screen. Okay, there are a couple of things that I would like to start today. Given the time, I'm just going to continue to start with several issues that we need to discuss, especially among the stakeholders in our efforts to develop early warning capabilities, and also especially learning from Indonesian experience in developing such capability. The first issue that I would like to discuss today is about the issue of ownership. Ownership in terms of the issues in developing early warning capabilities. So based on Indonesian experience, for example, we can see whether or not is it a state business only, or it is also non-state non-state business actors also. If we look at into the development of the early warning system, is actually stated in Law Number 7, years to 2012. Concerning the handling of a social conflict. In Article 10, Paragraph 1, the purpose of establishing an early warning system according to the law is to prevent the widespread conflict in the region. So the early warning system is implemented by the central government and local government. So based on this, then we can see that it becomes a state business. So when we look at into the ownership of the issues, then we can see that where's the space for the non-state actors. And then further, the early warning system is developed by means of research and mapping of potential conflict areas, and then delivery data and information regarding conflicts quickly and accurately, and providing education and training, enhancement and utilizations of social capital, and finally strengthening and utilization intelligence function in accordance with the provisions of the legislation. So as we see here, then I will go back into the question again, and who own the issues on the developments of early warning capability. Based on the things that I have mentioned to you, that it seems that it becomes more on the state side rather than the other elements of the community, in this case, the non-state actors. Let me just give you a sample case that we have based on our research at the Habibie Center in 2 provinces of Indonesia, in West Kalimantan and West Nusa Tenggara, for example. The early warning system is implemented by utilizing the networks owned by the government and non-government institutions. So down to the village level using text-based reporting. So information sharing has been carried out between the related institution, but is still partial and has not been processed centrally. So as we can see, and in the implementation, actually, then there is a big possibility for the non-state actors to also get involved and be actively participating in the developments of early warning capabilities. And the next issue that I would like to also highlight today is about the data, the importance of data in database. This issue is actually really crucial because we would like to have an idea that we will promote data-driven and also conflict-sensitive policy making. And then based on Indonesian experience, again, that we can see the development learning from Indonesia experience that prior to National Violence Monitoring System, the NVMS database that we have, we actually have 3 quantitative data on violence existed in Indonesia. The first one is Indonesian government statistic from the police records and village potential survey. And the next one, the second one is from NGO and state mandated watchdog reports on rights violations and violence. And number 3 is a large newspaper-based data set put together by the UN Support Facility for Indonesian Recovery, UNSPIR. And then we take a look at that into the developments of a database called a Violent Conflict in Indonesia Studies, VISIS, which later would be developed more into national violence monitoring as funded by the World Bank. Now, in our case, as a part of the institution that were given the privilege to use the data by the MVNS, is that the Habibie Center has produced, the first one is quarterly published policy brief. So based on the analysis that we have with the current data set, for example, we come up with a topic that might become the highlights of the violence that happens in provinces in Indonesia. The second one is what we call as thematic studies. So based on our overall assessment on the violence that happens in Indonesia, then we come up with a certain themes that we might go deeper. While the policy briefs tend to be more into quantitative, the thematic studies add the qualitative elements of the research to be reported. And then the next one is what we call as a violent intensity index. So based on the data that we have, the Habibie Center developed an index that focuses on the violence intensity that happens in 34 provinces of Indonesia. Although we can see from the experience that, and then from the information that we have, that the 34 provinces was were added. The complete 34 provinces were added at the last years of the NVMS. And then there's a question from the moderator whether or not NVM is the ideal model of an early warning capabilities. Well, it is more than sufficient for us to provide some data to analyze the possibility of not only violence in terms of communal violence, but also terrorism induced violence. For example, a colleague of mine at the Habibie Center, based on the data set that we have, based on the database, the information that we have in the database, could uncover the pattern of terrorism incidents in Poso in Sulawesi. So based on the pattern that we have according to data, then every October from 2005 to 2012, for example, there was always this terrorism incidents in Poso, Sulawesi. So that is also gives us the idea, the illustrations on how this kind of data set can help us in identifying a certain kinds of violence based on the pattern that was presented by the data. Another issues, points that I would like to highlight in terms of data and databases about the contributors who would contribute the data to the data. Based on the NVMS, we know that it is a newspaper-based data set that we can always go into making sure that the media that report the incidents can be verified as reliable. And also another points that I would like to add also is who are the gatekeepers for this NVMS, for this data set. NVMS was open to public, and then it was technically belonged to the ministry, the coordinating ministry of welfare. And then also another one is in terms of the idea of accessibility, who can access the database. So if we take a look at that, then we can see that there's always this possibility that such database exists, just like what the Indonesian police force have. But again, nobody can have access to that, especially the public cannot have free access to the database. Another one, we also learned about the question on whether or not NVMS model could be continued to be developed as an early warning system in other ASEAN member states. Well, my answer to that is yes, but there will be challenges for the NVMS-like database to be developed in other member states because of several reasons. The first one is the nature of NVMS data itself. It's a newspaper data set, so we have to look into whether or not the media operating in all ASEAN member states are open and free to report all the findings related to violence. The second one is the political will and the needs of all ASEAN member states. Some might view the database like NVMS as a threat to national security because it's basically just gives the description and also give informations about the intensity of violence that happens in one country. So some might question that as for the sake of national security. And the third one, another challenges that can occur in terms of data or database development is Indonesia's experience in discontinuing NVMS database might set an unfavorable view toward the use of such database given Indonesian position as the pioneer and a role model in developing such database. And the third issue that I would like to share with you today is this issue of network. Here we look at into who would be involved in the early warning capability in the system, in the network of the early warning system. What are the sources and sources credibility and the connection between the stakeholders that might be involved in the early warning system. And also of the questions of information and communication technology too, especially in communication network. And based on my explanation before about the example in 2 provinces in Indonesia, they just use a very simple text-based messages in order to just report any incident that might trigger a much bigger violence. And the fourth issue that I would like to highlight is the stakeholder identification and involvement. Are we going to also involve formal and informal leaders? And in Indonesia, we have what we call as Interreligious Harmony Forum, for example, which has been integrated in the efforts to prevent and also to de-escalate conflicts in many conflict areas in Indonesia. The next one is the academia, whether or not academia is given the space for that too. Especially, I think they would provide much significant input later in terms of analyzing on the content of the data that we have. And also the involvement of civil society organizations like think tanks, organizations probably. And another one is also, last but not least, in terms of the stakeholder, is the private sectors. And I'm sure that in I think I read 3 or 4 in Jakarta, at the time we were discussing about, especially among the track 2 forum that we discussed about how the private sectors can contribute to the efforts for peace reconstructions and peace maintenance. And the last point that I would like to mention here about the knowledge management and the practice expansion sharing. Based on the experience that we have at the Habibie Center, we have this sharing sessions and then sort of promoting this kind of database to several stakeholders and agencies in Thailand, in Bangkok, and also in Nepal, in Kathmandu. And we got about 2 other similar databases that are still operational now. The first one is the Deep South Watch in Thailand. The last update that they have was the summary of incidents in southern Thailand in October 2021. And also international alerts in the Philippines. The last updates that they have in their website was on Conflict Alert 2020, Enduring Wars, published in January 2021. As for NVMS itself, the last update that we have was actually in April 2015. So that has been 7 years ago, and it hasn't been updated as far as I'm concerned. So in closing, developing early warning capability is actually worth pursuing at the ASEAN level, despite the political dynamics that it will definitely bring. So I would suggest and recommend that this initiative can be part of the programs that ASEAN-IPR can continue to follow up this idea by inviting pool of experts to collaborate on this. So with that, I'm just stop my presentation, Pak Lawrence, and back to you.
Thank you, Pak Rudi, for a stimulating presentation that has given us much food for thought. Our second speaker is Mr. Alexander Douglas, the Deputy Regional Director, South and Southeast Asia, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. The Humanitarian Dialogue is an independent organization specializing in preventing, mitigating, and resolving armed conflict. Alexander has 2 degrees from Flinders University in Australia, a Bachelor of International Studies, and a Bachelor of Laws and Legal Practice. He has worked as an advisor, leading the Humanitarian Dialogue's work to prevent violent escalation in the South China Sea, and providing technical advice and support to programs addressing conflicts in Myanmar and the Philippines. His work has involved making peace processes more inclusive, preventing forced migration, reducing communal violence, and addressing how social media can inflame conflict. Alexander Douglas will be speaking to us about his experiences working on early warning system mechanisms in Southeast Asia. The floor is yours, Alexander.
Thank you. So Thank you for allowing me to speak today. As the moderator said, my name is Alex Douglas. I work for the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue. We are a Geneva-based foundation. We specialise in conflict mediation and peace processes. Our mission is to prevent, mitigate and resolve violent conflict. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the capacity for ASEAN to act as an early warning system. And today you're going to hear from a range of different speakers who are going to talk about very formal early warning systems and projects. And thank you for Rudi for sharing the MBMS. I think we're going to hear from some UN colleagues who are going to talk about more formal early warning systems from around the world. And I'm going to take a slightly different approach, which is to talk about get away from formal early warning system projects and instead think about it as systems. So early warning and early response systems are anything that identifies conflict risks and then acts to prevent violence. And that can be a lot of things. It can be a very formal system like you'll hear about today, or the MBMS that Rudi talked about before, or it can be much more informal systems. And they need to do three things. The first one is they need to listen. They need to identify what information needs to be collected that could give a hint as to that conflict risks are increasing. It needs to think about and analyze that information and communicate that information. And then it needs to act effectively to step in and prevent that conflict from escalating. So yeah, those are the framework that I'm going to be using today. Listen, think, and act. Now, ASEAN has a lot of different experiences about conflict early warning systems. And I'm going to spotlight three examples which have either been participated in by ASEAN member state governments or civil society organizations based in ASEAN member states. The first one is the Centre for Diversity and National Harmony from Myanmar. So they ran a conflict early warning system, and it had a team of people on the ground, including in a violence-affected Rakhine state. In addition to those people on the ground who monitored from a grassroots level, they also had specialists in social media monitoring who could assess whether there was an increase in hate speech online that could potentially increase the risk of violence. Now, if either their team on the ground or their social media specialists identified there was a high risk of violence breaking out, they would talk to the government or non-government teams that were deployed to prevent violence and prevent violence from escalating. So this was a system that ran during the previous governments. The second example is a different type of example, and it aims to address a different type of risk, which is, over the last 2 years, officials, so people from navies, coast guards, national security agencies, Ministry for Foreign Affairs, from the governments of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and China, have been participating in simulated crises in the South China Sea. So they have been looking through different types of simulations and different types of crises. And through this scenario-based process, it helps the officials to understand the risks, to build trusts, and helps to reduce the chances of crises. So this is an example of how countries around the region are thinking through the risks of conflicts and identifying ways to reduce those risks. Then the third part, again, is ACT. And a good example of acting on that information is a small non-government organization in the southern Philippines called Tumikang Sama-Sama. And they operate in a relatively violent part of the Philippines known as Sulu. They have a network of volunteers around the island. And when there is a clan conflict, a conflict between families or clans, those volunteers notify the Tumikang Sama-Sama. And the organization deploys a team of highly trained and respected non-government mediators to help negotiate peaceful resolutions to those clan conflicts. And so far they have secured more than 40 written agreements that have ended the types of clan conflict which result in people dying, but also obstructing development and undermining the broader peace process. So that's another example of an early warning, early response mechanism from an ASEAN member state. So we've just heard a couple of examples of what can happen at a lower level and the communal violence level. I'm now going to talk a little bit about what ASEAN as a whole can do and what capabilities it has, what ASEAN capabilities can be used in early warning. And conflict can happen at a range of different levels. At the community level, which is sometimes involve crime, and that's the type of data that you may see from the types of scenarios that MVMS that Rudi talked about. It can also happen at a national or sub-national level, and often that will involve rebel groups or separatist or revolutionary groups. Or increasingly, there's a risk of conflict between states, between nations. Both between member states of ASEAN and with external states. So I think there are a couple of big challenges facing ASEAN. The first one is working at the community level. It's about sharing the experiences that have been developed by ASEAN member states. There is a range of expertise held by ASEAN member state citizens about how to run these communal violence early warning networks, and they can be spread. And ASEAN can develop itself into a global centre for early warning global centre and centre of expertise for conflict early warning, and potentially share that expertise beyond Southeast Asia. But the second challenge is, how do we adapt those systems that are working at a community level to respond to conflicts and give early warning conflicts that are at the national or international levels of conflict? That's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. The good news is ASEAN is already acting as an early warning system. ASEAN listens, it collects information, it thinks, it analyzes that information and communicates that, then it acts. It acts to try and resolve or prevent violence and addressing those conflict risks. So I'm going to, using this listen, think and act framework, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what ASEAN is already doing and how it's already acting as an early warning system. So what is it? Listening, if we take listening first. So what information is ASEAN collecting? ASEAN collects a huge range of data, from economic information, from intelligence about military campaigns, cyber campaigns, weathers and disasters, food data. One of the most sophisticated early warning systems that ASEAN already manages is not on conflict, but is actually on food prices. So there is a large and quite sophisticated system within ASEAN to help identify and collect information at a regional level. And even more information is collected by ASEAN member states. So we already have a very strong listening function within ASEAN. Then there's the analyzing. So how does the ASEAN community analyze and communicate the risks that are emerging from the data that it's seeing and the information that's collecting? Well, we see a range of different forums that are used to discuss these types of risks, and that can be both formal ASEAN meetings, informal spaces like retreats that are off the record and enable more frank discussions. There's discussions that ASEAN has with civil society. There's discussions amongst permanent representatives and the Secretariat, and even AIPR, who is hosting this discussion today, is a forum by which ASEAN as a whole and the ASEAN community can think through conflict risks and analyze and come to some type of collective judgment. And then once ASEAN has come to that collective judgment, how can the ASEAN community respond effectively? We've already seen ASEAN respond effectively in a range of different cases and less effectively in others, but ASEAN is already acting on different conflict early warning issues. So ASEAN played an important role in de-escalating the Thai-Cambodia tensions. It has identified and appointed a special envoy for Myanmar. It makes and those kind of formal appointments of mediation capacity or of particular skills. That's what we think about when we talk about early response, but there's a much broader range of early responses. ASEAN can address conflict risks in a range of different ways, including just making collective statements, and ASEAN routinely makes collective statements about issues on North Korea and broader geopolitical issues as well. ASEAN has already established working groups amongst its member states that have built trust. When ASEAN was established, there was a relatively high risk that its member states would potentially go to war with each other. But through the process of building trust and enabling people to get to know each other, it's already addressing that conflict risk and acting on those conflict risks. And now ASEAN is developing its own resources and expertise. So it's developed as ASEAN Women's Peace Registry that acts as a group of people who can be deployed if required and requested by member states to address conflict risks. So that's how ASEAN is already acting. And I'm going to leave you today with a number of questions about, okay, well, how can we move from ASEAN's existing response to conflict risks? How can we enhance it and make it even stronger? So the first question is on the listening. So it would be good to have a think about which body could lead a process to build a consensus on what type of indicators ASEAN as a whole should collect and consider when looking at conflict risks. And what responsibilities would ASEAN member states to collect and share that information have? It would also be good to see what role it could be for member states, ASEAN member states, voluntarily notifying each other that there is an increase in conflict risks, particularly when it comes to geopolitical risks from states outside ASEAN. There may be an opportunity for ASEAN member states who feel threatened or who feel like the risk of conflict is growing to formally notify each other about that risk. The second thing second set of questions is really how ASEAN can think about the conflict risks and analyse them. So which ASEAN institution could analyse information relevant to conflict, and what informal spaces could allow member state representatives to collectively assess those risks? This is often a very sensitive issue, but creating informal spaces where sensitive issues can be discussed, I think, could be a very important step forward for ASEAN. And I think a big challenge ahead for ASEAN is what institutions can lead ASEAN's thinking about the risks of digital conflict, and what kind of what indicators can be collected and what processes could be established that could give early warning of digital conflict. And then finally, how can ASEAN build its capacity to act when it's collected information, when it's analysed that information and it's found that there is a high risk of violent conflict? How can ASEAN build its capacity to act? So it already has a range of different early warning capabilities, but how can they be built on? So there is some mediation capacity, there's humanitarian capacity, military, economic, cyber, diplomatic. How can ASEAN build its own ability and own capabilities to respond in each of those sectors? And what practices can be agreed in advance of a crisis about how those capabilities can be deployed? So this is my final slide. So a couple of kind of key messages that I would like to end with. The first one is ASEAN member states already have best practice examples of how community level early warning, early response systems can work. The second is that the ASEAN system is already acting as an early warning system, in that it allows member states to collectively discuss the risks of conflict. And then the final part is there are ways that ASEAN can enhance its ability to listen, to think, and to act on emerging threats, particularly at the national and international level. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Alexander, for your insightful comments and suggestions. And I'm sure this will provoke quite a number of questions during the Q&A session. But now I would like to introduce our next two speakers, who will follow immediately, one after the other. Mr. Mark Harris has been deployed to Jakarta as the first UN Liaison Officer to ASEAN since October 2014. From 2010 to 2014, Mr. Harris was recruited under the Department of Political Affairs to work on regional issues, including ASEAN, at the UN Regional Center in Bangkok. He has a Master's of Arts degree in Politics, Government and History from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Ms. Marlene Urscheler is coordinating the Risk Analysis and Prevention Unit of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. She has worked for the office in different capacities at the headquarters and in the field, including deployments to Senegal and Nepal. Marlene has a Master of Law degree in Human Rights Law from the University of Essex and a Master's in International Relations from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Mark, followed by Marlene, will share the existing early warning mechanisms under the UN, and which will follow a short video. Well, let me start by inviting Mark. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, and hope everybody can hear me. So, and thank you also to ASEAN-IPR for the invitation, and congratulations on your 10th year. As Lawrence mentioned, my colleague Marlene, who's in Geneva, will follow with the human rights angle, and then we'll have a video from UNDP, which is more of a multidimensional risk angle in relation to crisis and early warning. So I think the key message here is just, how multifaceted this is, and that came through in Alex's presentation as well. It's interesting to start with the, very much community level, on the ground level experience that we had from Rudi and also from Alex. And as he mentioned, we're going to hear more formal processes. So apologies to everybody after lunch that I'll take you through some UN formal processes. But I think it's interesting the way the three of us, and then Marlene as well, have read the terms of reference and how we're going to discuss these issues. So if you'll allow me, Lawrence and participants, I'll zoom back to a global level in order to help us zoom back down at the end of these three presentations from UN into regions, and then how to look at ASEAN. And I think some of Alex's questions that he's poised there will really help us through that. But just to note as well, from the UN side, as we're talking about early warning, in so many of our mission settings, national settings, it's this kind of information coming from academia, from NGOs, from civil society at the grassroots, at the community level, that's actually supporting the UN in a lot of its work. So I just wanted to note that we've heard some of the specifics there, but that's underlying the work that we're trying to do at more of a political level and an engagement level. So let me go through to the presentation. And my good friend Aoife, if you could go on to the next slide, please. This is the formal process I mentioned. I just wanted to say here to really acknowledge within our formal partnership, and it's a formal partnership with ASEAN, our engagement with ASEAN-IPR is an important part of our political engagement. We heard Rudi refer to OREDs, which are the ASEAN-UN regional dialogues, where we've had the space, the informal space to discuss these issues. And certainly from our side as the UN, ASEAN-IPR is a Track 1.5 platform, bringing together governments, international organizations, but also civil society think tanks, is playing an important role. Particularly today, it's interesting for me to have this subject come up. We'd wanted to include this in our plan of action, the subject of early warning. It didn't come through into our plan of action with ASEAN. Obviously, it's a sensitive issue, it's a complicated issue, it's a long process. So I think this is excellent that ASEAN-IPR has taken the decision to discuss this today. Of course, there'll be many steps to follow, but it's an important issue, as I think the speakers and also the moderator have highlighted. I think from the terms of reference, I've really taken the point about similar practices to be shared coming from the UN side. From my side, it won't be recommendations. I think it's more important to share experiences. ASEAN itself, as a regional organization, can look at those experiences and from other regional organizations to determine its own ways forward, as it's done on so many issues, as we know. And there again, as Rudi said, ownership is so important in these issues, regional ownership. Just to note here, there's an inclusion there of the plan of action on disaster management. As we talk, we'll hear so many linkages between what we're talking about in terms of early warning on conflict prevention, crisis prevention, with some of the disaster management issues. And I think we've seen ASEAN enter more into that realm of conflict-related disaster management response in recent years. I saw Adelina, the former head of AHA Center, was on the line earlier. It's an important role then. We've discussed this in some of our informal dialogues between ASEAN and the UN. If I can go over to the next slide, please, Aoife. So just some background. This is where we're coming into this from in terms of mandate from the UN Charter. I'll let you read that. Of course, we're all aware from the news this morning how the UN Secretary General is visiting the Russian Federation. I met with President Putin, and we'll go on to Ukraine as an example of some of this good office's work that is mandated to the UN Secretary General. The reason I put this in here is food for thought in terms of Rudi had mentioned political will within ASEAN. The ASEAN Secretary General has a different terms of reference, which are discussed amongst many to a UN Secretary General, but certainly this is what we base our work on as a UN Secretariat. And you see here the point about the appointment of special representatives and envoys that carry out the good office's work of the Secretary General. So I'll leave that with you. And if we can move to the next slide, I'll try and go through quite quickly. The UN Secretary General's prevention agenda. Extremely important to this Secretary General that he's prioritized prevention since 2017. If you see here, specific references to early warning and preventing violent conflict, and again, mapping, linking, collecting data from across the UN system. But actually the UN system is using academia, using NGOs, using member states, using a vast variety of information, social media, some of the issues we talked about as well. So that's on the conflict side of things, and that's support to national capacities. But also it's important not to underestimate the importance here of human rights and also economic factors. And I think from my colleague Marlene and also from UNDP, you'll hear a little bit more about that. And to echo what Alex said, ASEAN has its own disaster monitoring and response system, an early warning system already. Alex had mentioned the food crisis early warning system, but I think the AHA Center is quite well developed and sophisticated in some of these areas. And of course, as I mentioned before, there's strong linkages, and this is one of the UN Secretary General's priorities here, amongst the others on prevention. If we can go over, please, Aoife. This is to the next slide, please, Aoife. That's okay. We can share these afterwards, and that can be enlarged to read it in full, or we can share the reference. This is the latest UN Secretary General's report on our common agenda. Just if you can go back one, Aoife. Please, can you go back one? Thank you. I'm just using this to show how for this UN Secretary General, this comes up later, the regional prevention angle, the importance of regional. If you can go back to that one before again, please, Eva. That's it, thank you. Just 1 second. So the importance of regional prevention and regional partnerships. And here in this latest report, in terms of his next term and the way forward, to continue and actually to have more engagements with the regional organizations together, which is what the ASEAN Secretary General usually attends every 2 years, but that way to also strengthen those linkages between regional organizations as well. And certainly we see from recent events how, particularly for ASEAN at the UN level, there's a crisis within the region, and there's much, there's much of a there's much intention for ASEAN to look into these issues, as we've seen ASEAN do in recent crises within the region, to take a leading role at the regional level. So on to the next slide now, please, Aoife. And here, to go from global down to national level, this is the mechanisms, how we're working. The Executive Committee, Deputies Committee are chaired by the SG, and the Assistant Secretary General at a New York level in terms of regional country situations. There's also reviews with director level. And the important thing to note here is how these bring together the political, the peacekeeping, the humanitarian, the human rights, the development, and also the gender, the UN women representation within these committees. So it's multifaceted. I think that's the important thing, and it's also important for ASEAN as it moves forward as well, because that cross-sectoral element of ASEAN's work is so important, as we see in areas such as prevention of violent extremism. In terms of the actual mechanics of this, the UN Operations and Crisis Center is collecting peace and security, humanitarian, human rights, and development information from across the world, from countries, from UN country teams, from regional presences. And this is what's coming through as reporting, as recommendations in terms of, for high level engagement on some of these issues, also for a UN crisis management group. This information center, crisis center, is obviously, it's the UN, it's 24/7, but we'll hear later how actually the African Union is also 24/7 in their similar kind of crisis arrangement. Just to look as well, the Secretary General has support from 18 high-level advisory board members who focus on mediation from all regions of the world. From the ASEAN region, former Foreign Minister Martin Natalegawa, and also Marlene Hazer, who's now the Special Envoy on Myanmar. But it's a way through these regional experts to provide advice to the Secretary General, and also because they're all at quite a high level, this enables engagement of the UN with leaders, with governments, with regional organizations. And later we'll also hear how the African Union has a similar group, which is called the Panel of the Wise. So I think that's important to note how that informal kind of contact from former leaders supports the UN Secretary General in so many of these situations. And the next point here, I'm using examples from the region. We have a standby team of 8 mediation experts, including on issues such as dialogue processes, transitional justice, constitutional processes, who can deploy within 24 hours to conflicts across the world in order to support governments, UN teams, envoys, also regional organizations. So that's a form of conflict prevention in direct response to an escalating situation. It's 8 mediation experts on standby each year. Miriam Coronel Ferrero, I think we'll all know from the Philippines, she's a good friend of ASEAN-IPR, was last year on that panel. And then to look through to these missions, political missions set up, peacekeeping operations with representatives of the Secretary General, as I said there, to carry out those good offices functions within those missions, within those countries. Many, of course, having a regional function as well, not just a national function, and then to go on to these special envoys who are appointed by the UN Secretary General. Also here we see, such as in Central Asia, UN offices that are looking at cross-border issues across regional areas, and we have similar kind of setups in West Africa and also in Central Africa. And down at the country level, this is a new initiative within the UN Peace and Development Advisors within UN teams who are linking together with the development wing, with the human rights experts, and also often engage directly with government and civil society in order to look at specific situations. And of course, this is very much an on the ground early warning potential as well. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And of course, that's a vital area in terms of conflict analysis for those countries where that's applicable. On to the next slide, please, Aoife. Shouldn't be too many more. Just a very quick overview of the peacekeeping operations. Of course, on the political side, the SRSGs, the representatives of the Secretary General, have a good offices mandate. They very much engage in peace building activities, conflict prevention activities in relation to elections, in relation to political engagement between parties. That's a very big part and an increasing part of those mandates. But it's not just the military, it's not just the police, but it's that whole political wing. And as we see there, 87,000 peacekeepers in 12 missions around the world. And if I'm not mistaken, around 5,000 from the ASEAN region who are currently deployed to UN peacekeeping missions. On to the next one, please, Aoife. These are political missions and special envoys. On the left side, you see where the UN Secretary General has deployed special envoys around the world. You'll also see, I've just highlighted here for the Asia Pacific region, political missions, also this regional center. And as we're all aware, a UN Special Envoy currently focused, or specifically focused on Myanmar. So this is the range. And of course, all of those special envoys, representatives will have teams who are working together across the UN system, across government, across civil society, linking in with these early warning issues, and also hopefully trying to act on those as much as possible. So that's the kind of apparatus we have set up across the world as a kind of a formal setting, mission type setting, led at high level, reporting directly to the Secretary General, and often, of course, when appropriate, to the Security Council as well in New York. On to the next, please. And just to come a little bit closer to home in relation to Myanmar, just to have a quick review of that UN Secretary General Special Envoy's engagement in Myanmar. Obviously, more recently, it's become high profile in relation to the special envoys, but this goes back to 1995, and I've highlighted which of the envoys were from the region. You'll see there Tan Sri Razali from Malaysia. But this is really to note how these crises and processes are many years, and happen over many years, and how there's engagements, there's preventive diplomacy, there's conflict prevention, there's engagements through governments, through society. Of course, this is a difficult situation. I think I wanted to highlight here as well just how currently with the ASEAN Special Envoy appointed by the ASEAN Chair in 2021, that close engagement with the UN Special Envoys, and currently it's Norleen Hazer from Singapore. But also to note there, Vijay Nambiar from India, 2013, 2014, had engaged in some of these ASEAN UN informal dialogues in relation to Rohingya issues, in relation to the situation in Myanmar. And we were able to, actually, I think Rudi referred to it, have Myanmar host one of those dialogues in Naypyidaw, specifically on the work of ASEAN-IPR back in 2015. So there's the regional link that's been important, obviously, for these special envoys working on Myanmar. And yeah, I think on to the next one, please, Aoife. At the ground level, these peace and development advisors, you see here numbers of 61 internationals, 35 nationals, a total of 108 PDAs across the world in more than 80 countries. You see some of the examples there. This is that UN early warning really on the ground within a UN country team. And you see, some difficult countries there in difficult situations in Africa and others. And this really is embedded in a UN country team. It's, as I said, it's engaged with governments in support of government processes and engaged in conflict analysis as well. The development angle here, how to respond at that national level, but obviously linked into cross-border issues in many situations and regional issues. On to the next slide. I think we've nearly finished. These are some examples, if you can see, just of some of the work these peace and development advisors will engage in support of governments, in support of civil society dialogue processes. I think it's interesting here to see 70% of them have been engaged in preventive diplomacy, good offices work, but also many engaged in youth activities as well, youth peace and security support, and also work in relation to prevention of conflict before elections, and also linked to the last ASEAN-IPR dialogue, 34% working in relation to climate-related security risks, which is, as we're aware from that last dialogue, an increasingly important issue. I think it's also important to highlight that we don't often see the results of conflict prevention. It's difficult to measure because it's been prevented. I think that's an important point. Obviously, we know about conflict, we know about crisis. Many of these situations, it's impossible to measure how successful they've been, but obviously there's a lot going on, not just by the UN, by national governments, also national civil society, regional civil society. If I may, Lawrence, I'll save the last slide until my colleague Marlene has spoken, and my other colleague in New York. If I can hand over to Marlene, as I mentioned, and as Lawrence mentioned, she's from the early warning team at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and she's joined us from Geneva. So thank you for joining us, Marlene.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon, this morning. I will now, so it was Mark that zoomed out a bit at the global level. I will now zoom back in a bit on the African Union and their early warning system and prevention system at the African level, and specifically focus also on our work of the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights with this body and this cooperation and partnership. So next slide, please. Just to give you a little bit of a background, when the African Union was created in 2002, it was a shift away from non-intervention, and there was this African peace and security architecture was created. You see they have different bodies, and the one I want to focus on is this violet at the bottom. It's a continental early warning system that it is called, given that it's a hub for early warning analysis, covering the whole of the continent. There were several reinforcements since it was created, and there were additional elements added. Next slide, please. So what is the Continental Early Warning System, the CEWS, that's called in short, is responsible for data collection and analysis within the African Union. It has a mandate to collaborate, as it has been mentioned before, with the UN, but also with international organizations and research centers, academic institutions, and NGOs. I think other speakers mentioned as well this importance of early warning and prevention work to be holistic and not to focus on specific or one-dimensional data sources. Then the CEWS is bringing the advice to the Peace and Security Council of the African Union on potential conflicts, threats to peace and security in Africa. And it also recommends courses of action, how to diffuse these increasing tense situations. Next slide, please. The goal of the CEWS, of the whole system, is to anticipate and prevent conflicts on the continent, and also to provide timely information on evolving violent conflicts based on specifically developed indicators. So the CEWS has gone on to try to develop specific methods to foresee, to forecast, to come up with analysis that is sound to then be able to identify tense situations. And if you can move to the next slide, please. They have developed different strategies for this. One is the Africa Media Monitor. It's an online data collection tool that is situated in the CEWS Situation Room. This tool provides open source information, but it structures this open source information in accordance to keywords and specific filters, so that the information they are receiving through this is already geared towards specific indicators on early warning and prevention. Of course, also looking over a longer term on the outputs they receive from this tool, they can decipher certain patterns and the trends evolving. So if suddenly from a specific country there are sudden increase in reports of violence or reports of demonstrations being suppressed by security forces, this might be an indication of something is brewing up in a country and they might want to give a closer look. Then they also have developed the African Reporter. It's a primary data collection tool with structured regular data input. They actually rely quite heavily on inputs from close partners, civil society, that provide them with regular updates and reporting on situation as they observe it on the ground. They did do it in a way that the inputs is in a very standardized format that the partners are forced to use a rigorous methodology in terms of assessing, in terms of feeding the information back. This is, of course, crucial given that they work at the global level, not global, but the regional, so the continental level in Africa, to make it to get comparable results and be able to know and assess the different situations on the ground. Then they have what they call Africa Prospects. It's a structural vulnerability assessment tool. So this is actually a voluntary process for member states of the African Union to go through a process where the experts of the CEWS jointly with the authorities assess the different vulnerabilities of a country and the potential threats and risks of a country, to then jointly find ways to address this situation and to improve and strengthen the situation. So I think this is a very interesting project that is ongoing. There have been some examples that has gone away, but there still has some room to be rolled out more broadly. Then a key element of the CEWS system is also its close cooperation with regional economic commissions of the African Union. If you can go to the next slide, please. So the African Union is actually, it's the continental system, but it also has all these different warning systems at the sub-regional level. So specifically the ECOWARN system in Western Africa has a highly developed system itself that is then linked with the African Union system that is based in Addis Ababa. So the ECOWARN itself has a situation room and is then, through its own mechanisms, already at the sub-regional level, taking preventive action and engaging in direct diplomatic strategies. The queues has a special role in coordinating the efforts. Of course, we want to have a coherence in the strategy and not to get into a competition between the different agencies and the different actors. But at the moment, it's very much a coordinating role of the queues between the different regional actors, sub-regional actors and sub-regional warning systems that have developed, some before even the continental system was established. The queues is therefore seen as a continental hub for collection and exchange of open source information. Next slide, please. Now I would like to focus for a few minutes on the cooperation that OHCHR has developed with the African Union, specifically on early warning and prevention. The partnership with the African Union queues goes back for a couple of years, and the work was really to focus towards joint learning and see also what the African Union in their years of existence since 2002, now 20 years, have gathered in terms of experience, and being close to the ground, what we can learn from them and what they have achieved so far. And then, of course, OHCHR has developed its own early warning monitoring based on the human rights framework, which is an aspect that the African Union itself decided to focus on more strongly and integrate more strongly. So there was this exchange of experience that we wanted to develop through this project. The project was supported by the World Bank. As you may remember, a couple of years ago, there was this Pathways to Peace, the famous report that was jointly with the World Bank and the UN. And this was one of the elements that came out through this report. Next slide, please. Of course, I wanted to focus quickly on why human rights framework is relevant in early warning and prevention, because sometimes human rights is very much seen as more focusing on impunity, accountability, which is probably a bit on the other spectrum of the prevention, and then the opposed spectrum of prevention and early warning. So there are some key elements for human rights and key features of the human rights framework that make it very useful and key aspect of early warning. First of all, the human rights apply in all times, including armed conflict, for example. So it's going throughout the different cycles of violence, conflict, peace. Then, of course, also human rights are universal. There's consistency across countries, and it's reducing selectivity and partiality. It's important to remember that human rights are based on consent of member states or states, all states, by treaty ratification or agreement on customary obligations. Then it's also an existing monitoring system based on government's cooperation. So I'm referring here from the UN perspective, but there are, of course, similar regional systems to the human rights mechanisms, such as the human rights treaty bodies, such as the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review system, as well as the special procedures that are set up by the Human Rights Council, which is also a state body, of course. Then there is a strong correlation between the implementation and the achievement and delivering on human rights aspects and the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. Then I wanted to focus on the specific aspects of human rights and the importance for risk analysis for human rights, to have the human rights integrated into risk analysis. Because this is actually the essence of what we wanted to integrate and wanted to transfer to the African Union system. Human rights, when you integrate human rights into risk analysis, it will by default drive you towards the structural drivers and root causes of conflict and tensions. And oftentimes through the full-fledged human rights assessment, you will be identifying specific, for example, economic and social cultural rights violations that are driving the conflict and that are leading to further tensions. And if you want to address the conflict resolution, if you want to diffuse tensions, there will be a need to address those underlying root causes. It's, as I mentioned, in economic, social, cultural rights issues oftentimes, but also linked to this, the discrimination part. So structural discrimination issues, as we have often seen, is a key driver of frustration and root causes of conflict and violence. So it provides with a holistic approach. It's not just a band-aid to the immediate tensions that are building up, but also looking at underlying issues. Then the second aspect is very much the focus of human rights is the leave no one behind. Sorry. Applying a human rights framework will help you to to identify the persons at risk of being left behind, and then actually put them at the center of your analysis. If you use the human rights framework in your risk analysis, you would then in your process try to identify and look at questions. Are the current risks of violence, are the current situations actually increasing the risks for exclusion, and then are they disproportionately negatively impacting specific population elements and part of the society that might then be marginalized even further, so therefore increasing further tensions that are pre-existing. So with the human rights framework as the basis, these key questions and these elements will be part of the initial assessments of risk. Then going towards the accountability and democratic space, integrating a focus on accountability and democratic space means also to assess structures and channels of institutions to voice grievances and to protect the democratic space. So human rights is also very much looking into opening up channels and democratic ways of discontent to be able to be voiced, or to hold people accountable either through a judicial process, and that judicial process are accessible, are open, are to everybody, and are fair and just, as well as providing space for democratic space in terms of allowing protest movements to be voicing concerns, to have a democratic process of integrating these different views into discussion and debates instead of forcing it outside of the democratic systems. Then the last is the participation and empowerment. Human rights basis is very much looking at the people whose rights have been violated, putting them at the center, and then actually in direct contact with those partners, then to develop the course of action and to identify the response to the situation, and to find ways that the the victims can be helped to institute structures of self-help and to actually be able to achieve their own goals. It's very much focusing, moving away from a beneficiary approach to seeing individuals and people as the core and right holders, to be then the actors and not just the one receiving some goods. So then I just wanted I think this is coming to the end, so please the next slide. I wanted to bring these two parts together in this and provide you with some concrete outputs of the OHCHR CUES partnership. In this process, OHCHR and the African Union have developed jointly a human rights sensitive revision of the keywords of the open source media monitoring tool. As you might remember, in the first part of my presentation, I was talking about the Africa Media Monitor. Sorry. And with including more of a human rights focus in these keywords, we were able to ensure that the broader spectrum of open source information is reaching the Situation Room of the African Union. So there is guiding their actions more towards human rights integration into the analysis. The second concrete output was a joint development of a prevention-focused human rights framework. These would then cover the four aspects I had just mentioned, to bring it in a more broader way of a methodological advice for guidance for partners and teams to bring together the different aspects in a structured way. Then the last point was strengthening the gender dimension in prevention assessments of the African Union and the RECs, so the Regional Economic Commissions. This was an overall mainstreaming of the gender dimension into the African Union assessments and risk analysis points. So I think this brings me to the end of my presentation, and I hope I have I have been able to give you some insights into the African Union's early warning system and the interest of having a broad human rights basis on risk analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marlene. There's a request for you to have a sip of water in the morning in Geneva there. So thank you so much. And that was very useful to hear that importance of the mainstreaming of human rights through these processes, and as I elaborated, through those mechanisms within the UN as well. Human rights is a fundamental part of that. Colleagues, if you'll allow me, I'm going to introduce this video message from another colleague from UNDP in New York. It's 2:30 a.m. I assume he's sleeping, so he sent the video message. It's Mr. Corrado Scognamillo, excuse my pronunciation. He's an early warning specialist with the Crisis Bureau of UNDP at headquarters in New York. It's about 10 minutes. So if you'll allow us, he'll go through quite an interesting elaboration of the multidimensional aspects of crisis prevention, conflict prevention, and early warning. So over to you, Aoife.
Colleagues, good morning, good afternoon. Greetings from New York. My name is Corrado Scognamillo. I work with the UNDP Crisis Bureau. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share with you some of our work on early warning, early action, and in particular, our experience with the Crisis Risk Dashboard, or CRD. Before we get into the CRD, allow me to give you a little bit of an introduction on what is it that we mean in UNDP by early warning, early action. We like to describe it as a sequence of 4 steps in a schematic way. It's about first identifying and monitoring the right information, the right data points. Secondly, to process that information, analyze it through the lens of multidimensional risks. And then that analysis has to be put on the table of the decision makers, who ideally would do a regular scanning of the horizon to see, to look for emerging risks, and then trigger the early action, which for UNDP as a development organization is mostly about, well, ideally preventing crisis, if not mitigating it, but mostly about designing development programs or adapting existing ones. It also can include strategic positioning, and by that we mean the stance that UNDP can take on an existing trend or situation with governments, with member states, or with civil society. In the worst case scenario, it's also about triggering crisis response procedures and tools and resources as early as possible. Now, in order to support the first phases of the early warning and reaction sequence, we've developed the crisis risk dashboard, or CRD. And what it is, it's really a visualization platform to support multidimensional risk analysis conducted by UNDP and the wider UN. And the tool, what it does is it aggregates data, it allows you to visualize data and to overlay data. And any type of data can really be ingested in the CRD. Typically, we like to identify 4 categories. The first one is risk indices or development indicators and indices, the more typical things such as Human Development Index or the Inform Index or the Fragile States Index and so on. Then there's events databases. Increasingly, we're using, ACLED, that you might know as a political violence monitoring database. There's also GDAX that monitors natural hazards and a number of others. We have data that's about the news or text-based analysis that we either ingest manually or we integrate through automatically through APIs. We have also UNDP data, so information about our projects, our presence, our budgets, in order to see where we're present on the ground. Additional data sources can also be surveys and increasingly also social media, for example. Now, 3 main things about the CRD to keep in mind before we start is that it's a dashboard that is meant to be internal to UNDP or the wider UN in some cases. It focuses on risks, but risk to development, so with a comprehensive, broad approach to risks, and it's tailored to a different number of applications. It is an ecosystem, and by that we mean that what we've done over the past 5 years now is to build a data warehouse and acquire a technology stack that we manage here at headquarters, but we complement with country and region-based data analysis and solutions in collaboration with our country offices and the UN country teams. We also leverage a number of partnerships, including with the European Commission, with Microsoft, or with Columbia University, for example. Now, this feeds into the CRD architecture, which then in turn is translated into a number of CRDs that are available at global level for headquarters colleagues, mostly at regional hub level and at country level. For each CRD, we have the same type of approach. We like to call it user-centered co-design, and by that, we just mean that we work together with the users to develop a platform that is going to be helpful for their work. We start with a contextual risk assessment, meaning that we identify with the colleagues what are the risks that they want to track in a specific country or region. Based on that, we map out the data sets that are available, look for other data sources and proxies as needed, and then ingest those in our architecture. We also make a very strong emphasis on embedding the CRDs in the application, so in the existing business processes, because we know that if the CRD remains just a dashboard that one can use when they want to, it risks to not being used after an initial period of enthusiasm. On the other hand, if the CRD is actually really embedded in existing business processes, that's the one factor for success. And one last thing is that we approach this as a rapid prototyping exercise, and by that we just mean that we get out a first platform, a first version of the dashboard as early as possible, and then refine it through feedback. Currently, we're working with more than 40 country offices and regional hubs. We have 20 of CRDs that are operational and more than 20 that are under development. Here on this map, you have a rough idea. The green icons are CRDs that are operational. The yellow ones are under development, and the colors, the countries that are colored are covered by a regional CRD. you will see that there is one in the making for Asia Pacific with our colleagues from the Bangkok Regional Hub. And we have CRDs that are operational in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, as well as one in the making in Papua New Guinea. What are the applications of the CRD? We tend to identify three broad types of application. One is situation monitoring. So the CRD feeds into the regular situational analysis that our colleagues at counter-regional level conduct on a regular basis. Here you have an example from Venezuela, where the team has identified a number of indicators that they follow on a bi-weekly or weekly basis, and that feed into their reporting and their analysis to the rest of the UN country team on the ground. Another second big application of the CRDs is that it feeds into our programming and makes it risk-informed and more conflict-sensitive. It feeds into our strategic documents that frame our cooperation for a number of years, either at UNDP or at UN level more widely. It also feeds into the project formulation itself. Here you have a screenshot from Ethiopia, where the CRD was very comprehensive and was really mirroring the UN cooperation framework. And in this specific case, you have a screenshot from a page from the CRD that included a hotspot mapping conducted by the colleagues in the country, looking at what were the conflict hotspots. But it's also combined on the left side of the screen with a tracking of peacebuilding interventions, with the idea that you would then be able to compare the two and see if there were any gaps in peacebuilding interventions, looking at where the priorities should be, as highlighted by the conflict hotspot mapping. Lastly, the CRD is used also for external facing processes such as advocacy, resource mobilization, dialogue with the governments and national counterparts. Here you have an example from Sierra Leone, where the team had used the CRD to flag to the Vice President office that there were a number of areas that were particularly at risk and deserved specific attention in terms of social cohesion project. And this was looking at a number of indicators, including food security, demographics, gender-based violence, as well as more regular incident tracking. Now, the CRD, as I've described it, is really a tool still for diagnostic analytics, meaning that it's mostly about visualization, but increasingly we're developing additional features, and we're moving from that stage to the stage of predictive analytics. So moving from hindsight to insight. Currently, as I said, it's mostly data visualization and overlays. But what we're working on are features such as prediction based on conflict events, monitoring, text classification using machine learning and topic modeling, anomaly detection that would trigger early warning alerts, for example, looking at unusual trends in political violence or other phenomenon that would trigger early warning alerts. We're also developing increasingly social media monitoring applications and sentiment analysis applied to social media in particular, but with a view to, for example, detect hate speech. And in terms of applications, the CRD has been increasingly used to feed into UNDP's work on crisis, which, as you probably know, spans different aspects of the topic. UNDP is working both on preventing and anticipating crisis, responding to current crisis and recovering from crisis, as well as working on fragile context and protracted crisis. So the CRD really fits into all the aspects of UNDP's work on crisis and fragility, which is very broad and touches both disasters and conflicts, as well as socioeconomic crisis and health crisis, for example. In addition, the CRD provides a basis for UNDP and the UN also to discuss with national and regional partners about the need to more generally do crisis risk analysis, crisis risk anticipation, and advocating for the fact that this can help governments and regional organizations plan and prepare for possible shocks, be it financial shocks or climate shocks or governance turmoils, as is the case now, for example, in different parts of Asia Pacific. On this, I will end my presentation. I thank you for your attention. You have here my email address. Again, I'm Corrado from UNDP Crisis Bureau in New York. Please feel free to reach out directly or through the colleagues that have the ability to attend this workshop, which I'm sure is going to be very interesting. I hope to be in touch in the future, and thanks again for giving me the opportunity to present our work. Thank you.
Lawrence, if I may, I'll just wrap up now. Just one point for my colleague Marlene. There's a question in the chat about conflict mapping tools in Africa. You may be better placed to answer that. If not, we can get back to you directly. If you leave an email address, we can check with the Africa team. Aoife, if you could go on to my penultimate slide, and then I'll just wrap up. I wanted to try and zoom back after Alex had taken us into those questions related to ASEAN, and this will hopefully help with the chat, into other regional organizations. We heard at length there from Marlene in relation to the work of the African Union. On the political side, I thought this might help to understand that the Peace and Security Council in the African Union is made up of 15 of the member states, with the support of African Union Secretariat. The reason I say that is I'm not sure of the status, but there's discussion here and there, proposals here and there in relation to this kind of council in relation to ASEAN. Also the panel of the wise, which has in some respects similarities to some of the discussions we've had on pools of experts, and we've heard about the early warning system. Also ECOWAS and the other regional presences, I think it would be a proposal for our colleagues in ASEAN-IPR. It wasn't possible this time, but it's better to hear directly from these regional organizations rather than the UN talking about these regional organizations. But with some time, we could organize speakers from each of these regional organizations who all have early warning systems in place, some with support of the UN in special missions. So I'd just like to put on that on the table, Lawrence, as a potential follow-up if there's interest from ASEAN-IPR. It would be very valuable comparative experience, rather than coming up with recommendations from my own side. But just to end there from myself and UN colleagues by saying thank you, and we greatly wish to thank ASEAN-IPR as a Track 1.5 platform for the good work, and we look forward to working with you further in the future. My details are there. Please retweet anything that may come out later from this meeting. And back to you, Lawrence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, Marlene, and Corrado in New York for your detailed briefing and views on the UN's important work in the world. And I'm sure my IPR colleagues also will be very interested to hear about the views from the other organizations around the world on the establishment of effective mechanisms on this. And I will leave Katika and her colleagues to get in touch with you all in terms of the sort of areas and information that she would be interested in listening to. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree that our panel has given us deeper insights into how early warning capabilities can play an important role in conflict prevention. They have also raised several interesting proposals, which I'm sure you will have questions in mind. But before I throw open the floor, maybe I could pose one or two questions to our panelists. And here I would like to perhaps mention or ask, what do you think, and ask each of the panel that has contributed, what do you think is required from ASEAN as an organization to establish effective early warning mechanisms? I guess what I'm alluding to here is that, it's things that each of the panelists have also mentioned, but I'd like you to perhaps look at a particular area for each of it and talk about some of the sensitivities that might be involved, and how would ASEAN perhaps overcome these sensitivities to make either establish mechanisms or to set up new mechanisms that can be very effective in these areas. So perhaps if I can start with Pak Rudi first and then go down the line on this matter. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Lawrence. I think it's kind of a difficult question to answer in just a short amount of time, but I would like to point out about the importance of agreement first. So internally, then the ASEAN member states should come up with an agreement what they need, and then try to accommodate and compromise and what needs that need to be addressed in terms of developing the early warning system. Because I believe that each of the countries might have different way of seeing whether or not it is important for them to create this as a in the scope of ASEAN to create this system. Not to mention that I already put that in my presentations about some might think that as a problem in terms of their security issues, especially in the national security, because when we put that into data and it is open to public, for example, and then some might not see that as a good way to just put yourselves in the open regarding all the violence reports that happens in a country. So I think to answer the questions, that I would probably just ask the idea, starting with the ASEAN-IPR as I think in this case to be the leading sector probably in discussing about what are the needs of each the member states on the early warning system and what should be accommodated in terms of developing the system. So I think that might be my answer to that.
Well, thank you, Pa Rudi. Maybe now, Alex, can you were the one who actually raised most of the areas or what that ASEAN is developing mechanisms or has developed mechanisms and is cooperating. Although I'm not sure whether some of those mechanisms perhaps might apply to individual countries rather than the organization as a whole. But I'll leave it to you now to perhaps identify one and perhaps how we could overcome some of the sensitivities in that particular sector. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So I would probably distinguish between two different types of conflict. One is conflict that happens within a country and doesn't really affect another country. And that's the type of, and ASEAN has ASEAN member states have a lot of systems for managing that. So I think that the best way to make progress on that is really about establishing some type of sharing of experience. So a very practical way that could be moved forward is AIPR or another organization conducting a comparative analysis of the other conflict early warning systems that have been established. That could be the National Violence Monitoring System in Indonesia, or Deep South Watch in Thailand, or the International Alert System in Philippines. Those are all very world-class systems. So I think that would be one way to try and spread the expertise and share the expertise that exists within ASEAN member states. But that's quite different from thinking through how does conflict early warning, how that can work with conflicts that are either geopolitical or involve, ASEAN member states being attacked by one another or being threatened by countries from outside of ASEAN. And for that, I think that there's, that is a slightly more difficult problem because it involves developing new systems. But I think one step would be to establish some type of regular process by which representatives from the ASEAN governments, whether they are kind of formally endorsed or whether they're experts, go through a yearly process during which, in an off-the-record process, they talk about the risks that they see to the region. This can all be done in a retreat and doesn't need to be publicized or formal, but that process where they identify the key risks to ASEAN can be submitted up to the foreign ministers and ASEAN leaders meetings so that we encourage ASEAN to regularly look at over the horizon risks and can start developing policies to address them. So that would be my suggestion for how it can look at the geopolitical risks facing ASEAN.
Well, thank you, Alexander. I should say that, ASEAN has got lots of retreats in terms of at the foreign ministers levels, defense ministers levels, at the leaders levels and all that. But yes, I agree with you that it's worth exploring perhaps how we can inject more substance into such discussions over this. And it's a very sensitive area that we need to look at. But perhaps now I could invite Mark and then Marlene to add your experience in various areas that the UN has had dealings with, and what advice you could give to that you think would be suitable for ASEAN to look at seriously on this matter. Mark?
Thank you, Lawrence. I think going back to that sensitivity issue, I'm agreeing with Alex that actually that wealth of experience amongst academics, amongst civil society, early warning systems that already exist, not just on conflict, but other areas, there's a need to try and harness that to bring that together. So I think that at that level, particularly in national situations, already exists. So there needs to be some kind of, comparative compilation of those experiences. And several ASEAN-IPR events I've been to over the years have actually managed to do that already. So that's been a positive thing. But, it goes back to the question of, the political sensitivities of this. And I'm going back to the TORs, which are about how to advise the decision makers. And it seems to me, most of the PRs in Jakarta are also the governing council of the ASEAN-IPR. So, do we agree ASEAN-IPR as a Track 1.5 platform is a good area to have these kind of discussions? And I think what we've tried to do in all our dialogues is to bring in other regions. So I think it's extremely difficult for me, as you'll appreciate, to recommend what ASEAN should do as a regional organization, but actually to look at, some of those examples have already come through, African Union and others, to see how they're doing this and to actually relate that to how ASEAN could move forward. So I think if there was we'd be willing to support that as the UN. We have liaisons in many of these regional organizations, but just to spell it out, as we've tried to for a start today, how they may operate and what can be picked up and what can be modified by ASEAN. I agree with Alex there on the geopolitical front. It gets a little bit more difficult. And then certainly what's come up, this is on a personal level, you see the recommendations in relation to you need some kind of peace and security council within ASEAN, or even the East Asia Summit on the broader geopolitical front. I think maybe that could be explored. And of course, what we don't know in this, Lawrence, and I think with your background, more obviously than most of us, is the informal that we're talking about here. To what extent are these conversations already being had between ASEAN members and also EAS members as well? So to what extent does that need to be more formalized? That's another question. And of course, we know ASEAN in the early days, from what I read of the history, was much more informal, where leaders could come together without all this summitry and really talk these issues through. Now it's obviously a lot more of a formalized structure. But I think the most important thing for the UN to actually, advise, recommend to ASEAN is quite difficult. I think we can just provide information on how others do it. I think what's come across clearly here, 2 points, the importance of civil society networks, academic networks, in support of kind of research policy, which ASEAN-IPR is already set up to do. But I think the other point also is how to bring together other regional experience in order to do that. And so much exists already within ASEAN, just a question of really having a stock taking and all these issues, special envoys, panels of experts, that could all be possible as well, depending on how ASEAN itself decides to go forward on that. And certainly we're there to support that. It could be a long process, but it's an important one, as you said at the start.
Thank you, Mark. I recognize the diplomatic sensitivities of asking the UN to recommend to ASEAN, but perhaps it's a question of just making some suggestions and we'll take it up from there. But you raised a very important issue, which I was going to pose in my next question about civil society. But before that, I would like to hear, Marlene, have you got any suggestions you want to offer, since you cover an area which is also quite sensitive on the question of human rights?
Yeah, I think I tried to cover this also a bit in my presentation. So I think human rights can give you some good entry points also in terms of having more upstream prevention instead of, and the earlier you can actually take preventive measures, often the less tense the situation is, and it allows you to act in a early on. So that is it might be one of the elements that human rights can provide you with. And there is already a lot of assessment and human rights information for each of the states in the region that is available, and it can be also leveraged, and that's what we have started doing in our own internal processes, to use the information from the human rights mechanisms in a preventive dimension, to look at what are the recommendations coming out of the special procedures of the Universal Periodic Review, what is the essence of that, and what is the information that should be prioritized implementation of recommendations to then make sure that this is then linked to the prevention dimension. So this is one aspect, I think, where human rights can be helpful in. The other thing that in terms of the UN own prevention early warning, what was also often seen is the very siloed challenges that, there is a lot of information, but it's not brought together. And to bring together and the information sharing then allows to have a better overview. And based on this, so if you already manage to have a joint vision on the situation, then that is the basis to allow for informed decision making and early warning strategy. Because if each of the participants is looking at a different animal, then it's difficult to advise on anything. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Marlene. You've actually raised some important issues and processes in which I'd like to follow up when in relation to civil society and governments, which I think the other speakers have also touched on this, but perhaps I could ask you to each of you to perhaps do a deeper dive beyond what you have just mentioned. And that's basically, what are your thoughts into how governments and civil society, that means looking on both sides of the fence, what can they do in order to improve the context and the cooperation that they have within ASEAN? I mean, ASEAN has done this previously already, engaging at the different levels with civil society groups. But I think that it's become even more imperative nowadays, especially when you have social media and all these things coming into the fore, and the importance of hearing civil society groups, and that a lot of the ASEAN individual countries are also becoming more receptive to this. But what do you think are the best ways or suggestions that you could give for both governments as well as to advise to civil societies on how they can perhaps work better together? Perhaps now we can go in reverse. We'll start with, well, Marlene, you've already mentioned quite a bit, but would you like to add on? And then after that, we can go to Mark, and then Alex, and then Rudi.
I know, just on top of my head, what comes to mind is for both, I think I would not look at one unity. So civil society is never one thing. There are so many different actors and so many different perspectives also in society and in a civil society, ranging from more religious leaders to grassroots to regional activities to more human rights to more. So just to see it in a more holistic approach in terms of not just putting all in one basket. And the same goes for the civil society as well. Government is never just one entity. It has so many entry points, and to find ways where you can partner up and then actually jointly contribute, I think that's the best way to work together. And instead of seeing it as a one against the other, it's a joint work on specific issues and define what you want to achieve. Thank you.
Mark?
Lawrence, I'll jump straight. I think within the ASEAN context, fully agreed with Marlene. I mean, I've seen and met a lot of civil society over the years in ASEAN. Also attended some of the ASEAN Civil Society Forum events. It's such a broad bunch. of groups with so many different diverse interests. What I found on the political security side, and hopefully Rudi, who's a good friend, can support me on this because he's been at some of these events, is over the years, with the governments, ASEAN diplomats, and some of the think tanks and other civil society members coming together in informal fora, Chatham House rules, the comfort levels have surprisingly really grown in a small number of years, particularly under the auspices of ASEAN-IPR. But of course, civil society there within an ASEAN context and globally, it includes think tanks, it includes religious leaders, it includes civil society, whether the interests are human rights, whether it's environment. But certainly in those kind of discussions, I do feel that there's been a trust. And of course, we'd have to ask our colleagues in ASEAN-IPR Governing Council and Advisory Board how they sense that, but really quite an opening up, particularly in the last meeting before COVID 2019, on these risks that Alex had talked about, and really quite an open sharing from a number of experts, government and civil society. Where it gets a little bit more tricky, I've found, is with the ASEAN Intergovernmental Human Rights Commission. The civil society registration elements of that have actually become quite difficult. Obviously, human rights is an issue in all countries in the world. How to overcome that? I don't think any country's overcome that, but I just think by contact, by engagement, by that sharing of positions, if it's done methodically and in a genuine way, can actually help those kind of situations. But I do think in recent years, definitely an increase of civil society engagement. And if you look at areas such as prevention of violent extremism, women, peace and security, where we've been working, then civil society groups in those areas are being brought into ASEAN plans itself because there's a recognition of their work. Of course, it depends on member states, but I'd say it's kind of moved in a good direction from my perspective. Of course, governments and colleagues such as Rudi and civil society may have other opinions on that, and other independent civil society groups as well. But I'm sure Alex can enlighten us if you now hand over to Alex.
Thank you, Mark. I think you made several very good points in it. But perhaps I can just hand the floor to Alex to add on to this.
Sure. So how can civil society and government work together on early warning and early response? Again, I would divide it between kind of local conflicts and geopolitical conflicts. And for local conflicts, I would again highlight, just as an example, the team in the southern Philippines. So Tumikang Sama-Sama, they work very closely with the police, with the military, with local government, with local religious leaders to identify emerging conflicts that could escalate into violence. They then sometimes need to travel with a police escort to those places. So again, civil society working in cooperation with government agencies. And then the civil society organization will broker and mediate a resolution to the conflict, which can then be monitored jointly by the parties, by the civil society organizations, and by the government. And the government and the civil society organization at that local level work very closely together. The government very much benefit from having a civil society partner that is perhaps more trusted than the local government, but achieves the same goals. The government is also wanting to reduce the levels of violence and conflict within the community. So I think that's a good example of how they can work together at a local level. At addressing geopolitical conflicts, I think, again, if we break it down into that thinking and or listening and thinking and then responding. So the listening, there is a lot of expertise in ASEAN civil society organizations, including universities. Developing a consensus among civil society organizations across the region about the key conflict risks that face ASEAN. I think that would be an important step. And then developing some new ideas about how ASEAN can respond to those collectively, particularly beyond the short term, in the medium and long term. And perhaps there's a role for the ASEAN University Network to start building consensus amongst academics about how that can be done. And then finally, in terms of the response stage, not all responses to conflict or conflict risks need to be done by governments and security forces. Sometimes that can be done by civil society organizations themselves, who are sometimes less controlled bureaucratically, who can speak more informally through track 2 processes. And they're definitely a very important component in addressing the outcomes of conflicts. ASEAN civil society organizations have been at the front line of responding to the crisis in Rakhine State and the outflows there. So I think that's another example of civil society and ASEAN governments working together to prevent and also to respond to conflict.
Thank you, Alex. You have given us a lot of food for thought, but here I would invite Rudi to perhaps sum up the arguments and identify what you think is the 2 or 3 of the best things that you would want to see in terms of this better cooperation between the different civil society groups and governments. And whether you think that perhaps there should be even better coordination among the civil society groups as a start.
Okay. Thank you, Paul Lawrence. I think one of the issues that I would like to highlight is how we develop this participations of civil society organizations in both in the context of early warning system and also in terms of conflict resolution, for example. But I would like to go back to the first point of my presentations about the ownership of the issue. I think this is very crucial, especially when we want to make sure that the participation is not only joined by the government institution, but also the non-government institution. And I think in ASEAN, we got many civil society organizations that have been working on promoting peace and also working on early warning system to prevent conflict that happen. And at the national level, for example, let me just take an example on how in Indonesia, for example, we have 2 largest Muslim organizations in Indonesia named Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, for example. They got this, networks until the very lowest level of the government administrations. So that can become really good points and also good reference on how we can develop this participations of civil society organizations in developing early warning system. And the next one, in terms of at the more regional level, than the one that was touched by Alex's answer, was that on how we can also invite the participations of civil society, especially the international NGOs, for example, in the peace process. I think I can point out one examples on international contact group in the peace process of the Mindanao process, peace process in the Philippines, for example, in the entity not only consisting of other states, but also international NGOs too, to represent the civil society organizations in the region. So I think with those 2 examples, Pak Lawrence, and I think that we can see that especially with all the fora that I have attended with ASEAN UN regional dialogues, for example, then we can see that there's lots of this attention and also interest in making sure they are contributing to the peace process and also with developing this kind of early warning capabilities.
Thank you, Pak Rudi, for your comprehensive answer. And perhaps now it's a good time for me to open the questions to the floor. And the first question also has a little bit of overlap on this question of civil society. And this question comes from Mr. Ralph Stam from the Embassy of Switzerland in Jakarta. And he makes the point that Switzerland and many other UN member states regard human rights violations as an important early warning indicator. And Ralph Stam asks, what role can the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights play in early warning capabilities in the region? And I would like to ask all 4 of you to give your respective answers, but perhaps I would invite our UN colleagues, since it's human rights is something that Marlene is an expert on, and AICHR is the organization that, Mark, I think you mentioned it in your answers. So perhaps could we go around that way first? Marlene, ladies first, and then Mark, and then maybe Pak Rudi, and then Alex, to give your views on this question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, of course, that's exactly what what we would agree on as well, that of course human rights is an indicator for human rights violation, maybe a good indicator for conflict early warning. In terms of the specificities on the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights and its role to play, I would defer to others on this, because I'm not an expert on ASEAN and I don't want to speak on that point in a legible way. Thanks very much.
Lawrence, shall I jump in there? Thank you, Marlene. I fully understand that you're on the global desk. Thank you for the question, Ralph. What I would say is, as we've said here, and Marlene's briefed us extensively on, is how human rights is integral to early warning mechanisms, to the conflict prevention, how they could work together with ASEAN and IPR with some kind of ASEAN mechanism is a good question, because within ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, I think there's been some, and please anyone correct me if I'm wrong, some attempts for voluntary national assessments of human rights situations to be shared within that commission by some of the member states. Others haven't done that. So this is where we come back to some of those sensitivities that Lawrence has been pushing us on, is how do you bring that together within an early warning system? I mean, there could be civil society, academia, think tanks sharing information, but at the same time, through the Intergovernmental Commission, it's a mixed group, some government representatives, some civil society representatives. I think we need to look at other examples. I think it needs to be thought through. Certainly, I don't think we could ignore it, and certainly from the top down, we need to have those human rights considerations integrated into any platforms that might be set up. The sensitivities, and I think, as I keep saying, this deserves a lot more study by ASEAN-IPR together with ICHA on how this could potentially come together. It's not only human rights that comes into this. I see one question in the chat related to environment, climate risks as well, food security, others. But this is a big issue. But luckily, we don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel, but just modify, adapt, with ASEAN, of course, in the lead to do that. So it's a good question. I'm interested to hear what my colleagues from civil society think about this, if they're engaged with ICHA as well. So back to you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Mark. It's something also that we would like to hear too. And perhaps, Rudi, you could start by enlightening us on this issue.
I just want to add one thing. I mean, I think it has been covered by Mark also, that on the roles of the civil society and also the human rights issues in ASEAN. Then just go back into on how we just utilize the agencies that the ASEAN already has, such as ICHR and ASEAN-IPR too. And I think with the pools of experts that the ASEAN-IPR has, then we can just also trying to make sure that this pools of experts can also contribute on how we incorporate the issues of human rights in the discussions about conflict and also in the other issues related to early warning, especially regarding to human rights violation.
Thank you, Rudi. I think these are things that my colleagues at ASEAN-IPR will certainly be paying a lot of attention to also. Finally, can I invite our final speaker?
Sure. So let me answer the question about how ICHA can be involved in early warning using an example, an imaginary example. So imagine that, I have been talking to some of my Malaysian counterparts, and Malaysia is a very multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, and overall they've lived a very harmonious life, but people still feel vulnerable, particularly to outside disinformation campaigns. So imagine there is a country outside of ASEAN, far away from the region, that is trying to undermine social harmony and social cohesion in Malaysia by provoking religious distrust. Now, if that was to happen, that should be considered both a conflict early warning indicator, but also a breach of human rights. when there's an international disinformation campaign that undermines people's right to safety and security, also their ability to participate in their government in a huge range of potential human rights violations from outside disinformation campaigns. So how could AICHA respond? So imagine that the Malaysian AICHA representative went and started, was looking at this. They understood that this is a problem. They could then go and talk in an AICHA meeting and saying, this is one of the threats to human rights in my country. We can imagine this being, you may also suffer the same type of disinformation campaigns from outside the region. And then they can start thinking through how they could respond. And there's a number of ways that AICHA could suggest responding, from digital literacy campaigns all the way to developing norms for that makes it clear that ASEAN does not accept that these types of disinformation campaigns are legitimate ways of conducting business in the international system. So that's an example of how I think AICHA could both be involved in the early warning, but also the early response. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I think you are quite prescient, because some of the things you touch on is contained in the next question from the audience, from Maria. She asked if early warning capabilities can also be applied to analyze outside actors influencing outcomes in host countries. So perhaps we could go around again through the panel. Maybe we'll start with Rudi, if you can, to comment on this question.
Sorry, Paul Laurent, which is it on the chat box, or just
no, this came as a question from the floor, from Maria. That's all I have from there. It's from Maria. And she asked if early warning capabilities can also be applied to analyze outside actors influencing outcomes in host countries. That means outside actors outside of ASEAN. So this could be states, or this could be civil societies, or informal groups, or personalities influencing outcomes in various countries within ASEAN. Yeah.
Well, as I think we can also safe to say that with the early warning systems that we have, or the one that we're trying to do, for example, we can also it can also be used to help identify what other actors that come into play in terms of a certain kind of violence that are recorded in the data. And if I go back into a national violence monitoring system, for example, in part of the data that we have, we have a part where it identifies the actors of the in terms of the violence. So that way, then we can also see that who would probably become the most influential actors in instigating and also in promoting the violence, and also making sure that the violence de-escalated, for example. So I think if we look at into some other, whether or not it will also identify the external, then that will go back into on how we utilize the early warning system as a part of a set of data, whether or not it also identifies the possible actors that come into play in that. And then again, as the example that I mentioned to you about my colleague who could identify the patterns of terrorism related violence, for example, that can also help anyone, especially the government, the state, and the non-state actors to work on trying to figure out who the actors might be, and then that can help in de-escalating the issue there. Yeah.
Okay, perhaps Alex, can we have your views?
Yes, I think the answer, can early warning systems be helpful in detecting operations from outside of ASEAN? I think absolutely, and it will need to. ASEAN has made a lot of progress in building trust amongst its member states, to that, yeah, with one or two exceptions, ASEAN has been very peaceful. And so I think the geopolitical risks to peace in ASEAN don't come from between member states, but come from states from outside the region, and sometimes from non-states. We've seen, extremist groups launch online operations to try and recruit people from ASEAN member states. And so an early warning system could be established to detect those types of risks, where ASEAN could agree to monitor those types of foreign interference in their domestic politics or in their domestic information ecosystems. Then they could come together and discuss whether it's just one state that is suffering from these online interferences, or whether it's multiple states, and then come collectively to a decision about how they can respond to those, whether that's an attempt from an outside power to change an election or to recruit people to extremist groups. I think ASEAN can act as an early warning system for those types of threats. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And I think that's very sensible in what you say, but of course it would depend on the circumstances involved. But perhaps now we can ask Mark and then Marlene about this issue.
No, I would agree with Alex. I think absolutely. I'm quite struck by ASEAN foreign minister statements and even the concept note for this meeting that's been approved within ASEAN. How there is that reference to the geopolitical, to the big power rivalries. So in answer to the question, I think we need to look at external states, whether in the immediate region, whether at a global level, but also non-state actors. We've talked terrorism, also transnational crime. Those influences within the region are all global networks. And what I would say, for that comparative example of other regions, some of those UN missions I mentioned there are based in the Sahel, so it's a multiple coverage of different nations within Africa, but also they take into consideration obviously other international actors across the world, and also Central Asia. If you look at Central Asia, look at Afghanistan, we know immediately that there's other actors in many countries in the region and broader regions and globally that are involved with those conflicts. So certainly on our side, this would have to be part of that early warning process. State actors, external state actors, as well as non-state actors, and there's many examples of that. It's maybe a little bit different if the focus of the early warning, Rudi and with Alex, we've looked at some quite local examples within the region, may not necessarily have that external factor, but certainly, with the help of Alex's discussion there of the geopolitical, the international conflict pyramid, it would have to encounter that. The question is political will, and what kind of a structure or what kind of a platform forum could we put in place. I mean, at the moment, somebody mentioned in the chat the ASEAN regional forum, but also the East Asia forum. I mean, these are actually covering many countries, big countries across the world, both of them. And there's those kind of fora as well that could figure into this. But again, there's political sensitivities around it. I think it needs a lot more study, but I think it would need to happen. And over to you again, Lawrence.
Marlene?
Yeah, thank you. I definitely agree with whatever has been said. I think an early warning system, to be effective, it has to look at all the actors that play an important role. And just to give you also examples from the global level, from the UN own prevention mechanisms, for example, there has been discussions about migration. And if you only look at, for example, the Middle East and not look at the receiving and the sending end, you need to look at the global trends of what is happening and why are people leaving, why are people coming, and what is the general situation there. So I think that would be a failure to exclude and to restrict it to a specific sub-region. But of course, it's politically very sensitive. It needs to be well managed in that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to take up the point that Mark also raised a bit earlier in mentioning about the ASEAN Regional Forum. But this one perhaps I can throw open to the floor also, because the question comes from Myanmar. I hope I've pronounced the person's name correctly, who asked, if the ASEAN Regional Forum could be a suitable platform for peace and security issues in the region, and if the UN can be involved for these discussions that they have. I trust that all of you are familiar with the ASEAN Regional Forum. It is a regional security platform involving the countries of ASEAN and most of Asia, as well as the major powers, to come together to talk about regional security issues. And they have been an established institution that meets annually since 1994. Okay, so the question from Myanmar is that whether it still can continue to be an effective forum and a platform to discuss these peace and security issues, and whether the UN can be involved for these discussions. So it might be a little bit, no, in fact, I think it is still relevant, because one of the issues that the ASEAN Regional Forum discuss is on confidence building, but more so on preventive diplomacy, which is the question of early warning matters also. So perhaps could I get the viewpoints on this, starting with our, say Alex.
Thank you. I see it as a potential kind of site for both for early warning, but also a potential site for early response. When I look at the risks that face the ASEAN region, I think one of them is geopolitical competition between the US and China. And I think that if ASEAN was to decide that this is a real threat to its own security and its own prosperity, then it can take an active role in trying to minimize those risks. And perhaps if there's a way for ASEAN to use the ARF, which includes both China and the US, as a way to reduce those tensions and play an active role in managing that conflict, so that it stays in the competition realm and potentially the cooperation realm without escalating into conflict. So I think it's both a site of early warning, but also an important mechanism for early response.
Thank you. Rudi, before we open the floor to our UN colleagues to answer the question about the UN part.
I just want to add one other thing is that the Asian Regional Forum can also be a venue for discussions among the members about the political will in terms of conflict prevention and also peace maintenance in the Southeast Asia, especially when we look into the just what Alex mentions about the power competitions between China and the United States, for example. So using the forum, for example, to just allow everyone to voice their needs and interests, and at the same time highlight the political will that put the peace as the main importance, or the most important aspect to uphold in Southeast Asia. I think it's still relevant for me to see that ASEAN Regional Forum as a venue to discuss more on, especially on early warning, and also just like what was mentioned about the response.
Thank you, Rudi. I agree with you fully. It's a good platform for all the countries to give their points of view, but let's hope it doesn't just degenerate into a talk shop or just hurling accusations against one another, but they really do address the questions on how can we do effective preventive diplomacy and build on the confidence building measures and the trust that such forums are supposed to generate. And perhaps here maybe the UN can perhaps provide some, I wouldn't want to use the word advice, because Mark is very touchy about these things about the UN giving advice, but perhaps you can share some experiences, both Mark and Marlene, on this matter.
Thank you, Lawrence. I definitely wouldn't give advice. But what I would say is within the partnership agreement we have, sorry to be formal here, but it includes engagement with the ARF and also with the East Asia Summit. Let's not forget the East Asia Summit. So I think at a technical level, below the high political level of the ARF, we're engaged, for the various sessions and the various sectors on confidence building measures, preventive diplomacy. Some of our standby mediators have joined those meetings. I've joined those meetings. For example, Miriam, who I mentioned, also peacekeeping, disaster management, prevention of violent extremism, as well as transnational crime. So we are involved at that technical level with ARF. We're not a member of ARF, but certainly from the UN side, we do see the value of ARF, particularly Asia Pacific, the inclusion of DPRK as a member of ARF, who seems to routinely participate in those meetings, is important in itself. So the UN is supportive, and when we're requested, we do join. And I think something that was important that we did together with ASEAN-IPR colleagues just in December with ARF was support the Brunei-led Youth, Peace and Security ARF conference, which linked to the ARF statement, which was the first statement on youth, peace and security, which we're now trying to move forward together with ASEAN-IPR. That's an important issue that we haven't really spoken about here. So ARF does have its value. On our side, at the high political level with the East Asia Summit, which is a lot newer than the ARF, there's been various years where the UN Secretary General has addressed the leaders of East Asia Summit, going back over the last 10 years on political issues, obviously. And that's all part of the summitry, which is so important of ASEAN, and it brings so many leaders together. And I think, on our side, I began with that photo, which looked like it was very glossy for an opening for the presentation. But, it's an important biannual meeting that the UN Secretary General has with the leaders and also the foreign ministers of ASEAN behind closed doors, where it's actually very open on a lot of issues. So within an ASEAN context, we're supporting in that way. And of course, those issues don't just focus on ASEAN. Many of them are geopolitical as well, obviously. ASEAN's concerned about the geopolitical situation. So hopefully that answers the question in quite a formal way, but we are engaged and we do see the value of all these dialogues, all these fora, all these platforms, whether they're just pure track 1, but especially like this forum, track 1.5 as well. It's important. Hopefully for Marlene, it won't be too difficult for her. We only spoke last week about ASEAN for the first time, but maybe you have some other thoughts on UN engagement in other parts of the world as you've got the global mandate, Marlene.
Thank you. No, that's what I also wanted to mention. Of course, there's a lot of engagement with the UN and regional and sub-regional institutions, like you also mentioned UNOWAS, and they work very closely with the ECOWAS teams in West Africa, the same as the African Union level. So there's a lot of engagement. The question is always, what is the openness? What is the willingness also of the regional mechanism to allow the UN to be present, and what is the space that is given? So I guess that there are many examples across the world of cooperation, and that can be also used in this context. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me go on to a follow-up question, and it's a follow-up on an earlier question also on the question about the sort of interference by state actors or non-state actors outside the region. So the question deals more with the fact that with social media, you get so many narratives being floated in there. Not only just from outside, but counter narratives also from inside the ASEAN countries and all that. So how best would governments address these questions or these things that come out, and how much do you think all these things can be done as part of an effective mechanism to address this question about conflict management? Perhaps could we start with Alex?
Sure. How do we stop foreign interference in ASEAN member states?
Not so much stopping the foreign interference, but the question is, there would be a lot of counter narratives and different perspectives on this. So when you, given the different member states involved and also the public, the general public, how best should ASEAN respond to these things in terms of developing the so-called proper or the true narrative on a particular issue? And how can this sort of thing be developed within the mechanisms that we are discussing?
Thank you. So I would think about it like a supply chain. When these operations start, and it's no longer are we talking about people coming up with just bad ideas. Most of the time, we're now talking about sophisticated, well-financed, very deliberate efforts to spread disinformation for a strategic goal. I think that is really the big threat that is coming over the horizon. So how do we stop that? Well, we have to, it is a supply chain. At the top of the supply chain, somebody is producing that misinformation, those faked videos or the incorrect fake news articles. Then slightly downstream, somebody is distributing them. So that's often, it's often social media sites like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, but sometimes mainstream media. And then finally, there's consumption. So people who are consuming them and are changing their behavior because of those narratives. I think we need to address it at all levels. At the consumption stage, we can try and encourage people to have better digital literacy. And I think there has been some steps towards that at an ASEAN level, establishing a range of materials that can help integrate digital literacy into school programs. Then there's at the distribution stage. So I think states and ASEAN as a whole can work with the platforms to ensure that the Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Line and WeChat aren't being a platform for disinformation operations by external states. But I think most importantly is establishing some norms about that this is no longer acceptable behavior. And so I think that's a big challenge ahead, is trying to work out whether there is a way that we can build some consensus amongst ASEAN states about not allowing disinformation operations from outside their country, either inside ASEAN or beyond ASEAN, while also preserving space for regular diplomatic debate and for citizens' voices. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Certainly very valid points and much food for thought. Perhaps now I can turn to Marlene on this.
Yes, thank you. I mean, for OHCHR, this is very much a debate of free speech and where is the limits of free speech, which is defined as where it turns into hate speech that is inciting violence against persons. So I think for us, from the human rights perspective, there is quite a developed framework on how to regulate hate speech and how to ensure that incitement to hatred is followed up and is prevented. But it is a very narrow and well-defined subset of fake news or untruths that is, but then also you go into the definition, what is the truth and what is just counter visions of the different aspects of the world. So for us, in taking action is definitely linked and limited to situations where hate speech turns into incitement to hatred and violence. So that's from the human rights perspective. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Marlene. And you've actually raised a very important issue, the question of what is the truth. I mean, even if you take the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I'm sure what is the truth to Russia is certainly not the truth to Ukraine and vice versa. So that is an issue also that has to be addressed. Although I would think that in this case, it's to counter the narrative coming in, say, within the ASEAN, I mean, against whatever issues that are being discussed within ASEAN on this. And perhaps on this, maybe, Mark, you've got something to contribute.
Can I just jump in and respond to that as well?
Yeah, sure, Alex.
Yeah. So I think Marlene has spoken very much about the content of those types of operations. I think we also need to think about the behavior. So in some sense, it doesn't really matter what is being said. If there are networks of thousands of fake accounts that are being used to perpetrate a network and many bots that are used to make things artificially go viral, that if we can develop some norms to say this is not acceptable, then we are able to avoid some of the really tricky issues about freedom of speech. Because I don't think anybody really defends the right to run thousands of buzzers in Indonesia or trolls, they're called in Philippines. When we're that level of disinformation operations, I think should be clearly considered unacceptable.
Thank you, Alex. And that one, I think we would have a panel plus a moderator that would agree fully with that. Mark?
I think for Alex there with Elon Musk's recent purchase of Twitter, maybe that could be taken care of. But going back to the question, Lawrence, you're raising some difficult existential questions on what is the nature of truth and are there any true narratives left in the world? I think just to go back to there's no answers to that. It's increasingly complex across the world, not just in ASEAN. I think to just go back to the original issue of hate speech and some of those issues in ASEAN, what I was struck by 4 or 5 years ago under the ASEAN Regional Forum, actually, in discussions of preventing violent extremism and hate speech in relation to violent extremism, is just some of the good work being done. Specifically there, the Malaysian Southeast Asia Center on Counterterrorism, I think in Singapore as well, and other institutions within ASEAN, actively engaged in counter narratives, but actually alternative narratives in relation to that. And if I'm not mistaken, this is all factored into ASEAN's own prevention of violent extremism plan, which ASEAN-IPR is linked to and the UN is supporting. So in that specific area, you have that. In our plan of action, we have the area of cyber security and what we called peaceful environments. And we are intending, Alex, please join, to have an informal dialogue, ASEAN-UN, in relation to hate speech, misinformation, disinformation that's been proposed from our side together with your colleagues, Marlene, in OHCHR. So we're hoping to have that. It's an important area. But I think the issue there and the balance that we get into is freedom of speech in relation to some of these issues. On the political side, not just in ASEAN, but in other parts of the world, how criminal defamation can be used as well. So this becomes a really tricky area here. So it needs a lot more thought. And I think when you start to think much bigger in terms of that foreign intervention and disinformation, how that can really affect political situations, and how elections themselves within nation states, within ASEAN and across the world can be impacted by this. We're really moving into a very new realm, and we really need to be prepared for this. So in terms of any early warning, this really must be part of that issue. And it was good to hear so many of the colleagues today, and also in so many of these UN missions, that hate speech and some of these issues really do factor into the peace building work in order to prevent conflict. So I think that would be my answer on that, Lawrence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and agreed with you that these are very sensitive issues and difficult issues, but I think it's something that needs to be addressed, and we hope that it will be done sooner rather than later, and it could start with that conference that you all are trying to put together. Well, finally, the best for last. Rudi, you have the floor, but first we would like to ask you, how much are you investing in the new Twitter under Elon Musk?
Well, funny thing is that I don't have a Twitter account, but I just usually my brother's account to just peek into what's really going on in the Twitter world. So, yeah, I think to answer the questions, then I just want to speak from a CSO perspective and experience too. I think we need to increase the literacy among the youth and also building counter narratives towards the violent extremism. And I think we have done that in the past few years, especially using, I think in my short bio, I just mentioned about Cerita. Then that's also one of the venues that we use to build tolerance among the youth, and also to allow them to build and to develop counter narratives toward the issues that lead to divisions and also lead to violent extremism. So I think the key to that, if I recall one of the points in the World Peace Forum, the third World Peace Forum communique, was that we need to involve the youth in this, because it is more into it is their generation that has been fully or mostly affected by this sort of phenomena on how these violent extremism narratives are just all around about hate speech. That's my addition to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudi, and a valuable addition it has been. You know, folks, we have a whole clutch of questions over here, but this would mean that we would probably, well, we have enough questions actually to do another webinar on this same topic. But I won't want to hold our speakers back because I'm sure they are very busy people also, but I would like to thank them and to thank the audience. And I think the very fact that we have a clutch of questions shows is a testimony how much our audience has enjoyed this discussion, you know. And thank you very much to the speakers and to the attentive online audience for kicking off this ASEAN-IPR discussion series of 2022. And it's certainly been highly relevant and an interesting discussion and leaving much food for thought, not just only with the audience, but we hope with the speakers, but certainly with the ASEAN-IPR group. And there will be lots of follow-up on this, I'm sure. Now let me perhaps hand the floor over to Katika to formally thank our distinguished speakers and to bring this session formally to a close. But thank you very much for all of you, to all of you. Over to you, Katika.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Lawrence Anderson, for moderating this afternoon's discussion so ably. And we would also like to thank our distinguished speakers for their time, for the presentation, and for answering all the questions posed by the audience. We apologize that there were some that we could not raise due to limitation of time. But nonetheless, we are very appreciative of everybody's enthusiasm in taking part in this afternoon's discussion. The organizers has shared a link for the e-certificate to this webinar. The link is in the chat box for participants in Zoom. If you are having difficulties in opening the link, please send us an email. The email address is currently being placed in the chat box as well. Please let us know if you are encountering any problems in obtaining your e-certificate. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the first session of the ASEAN-IPR discussion series 2022. Thank you for all of those in the Zoom and for our viewers on YouTube as well, who have followed the discussion from beginning to end. You can review the discussion that's taken place this afternoon on our YouTube channel. And we hope that you'll be able to join our next session. Keep a close eye on our social media platforms for information on what the next topic we will be discussing. So in the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy, and until we meet again, thank you and good afternoon. Thank you, sirs, madams. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Pak Lawrence,
thank you, Pak Puja. Thank you,
Pak Makaris. Alex.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Pak.
Thank you, Pak Puja.
Thank you so much. All the best. Stay safe.
All the best, Pak.
Thank you, Pa. Safe too. Look forward to seeing you once we can do this free travel to and fro our countries.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. I just
Thank you.
Leave the meeting, and then I'll see you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Pak Rudi.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Pak Alex. Thank you, Mr. Lawrence.
Terima kasih.
Thank you.
Terima kasih. Thank you, Miss Marlene.
Selamat berjumpa lagi.
Sampai berjumpa lagi.